On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I am your moderator for this evening, and it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Moisés Naím is a senior associate in the International Economics Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and also the chief international columnist for El País, Spain's largest newspaper. Before joining the Carnegie Endowment, Dr. Naím was the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. Many of you may remember that. Under his 14-year leadership, the magazine was relaunched, won the National Magazine Award for General Excellence 3 times, and became one of the world's most influential publications in international affairs. Dr. Naím's public service includes his tenure as Venezuela's Minister of Trade and Industry in the early 1990s, Director of Venezuela's Central Bank, and Executive Director of the World Bank. He holds a PhD and a master's degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I can tell you that you are in for an evening of some very fascinating insights. I had the good fortune to read his book, and I found it riveting. And you don't need to take my word for it, because on the back it says, "The end of power will change the way you read the news, the way you think about politics, and the way you look at the world." William Jefferson Clinton. That, Dr. Naím.
Thank you, David. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. Thank you to the World Affairs Council, Jane Wales, a dear friend and the leader of the World Affairs Council. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then let's have a very open-ended conversation and exchange about these ideas. We know that I think there's nothing new if I tell you that the power is shifting. Power is shifting from the United States and Europe to Asia, and is from north to south, and from presidential palaces to town squares, and for big companies to startups, and in some places even from men to women, and to the older people to the younger people. And those are trends that are by now are well known. We have evidence, daily evidence, that the power is shifting in ways that are surprising and important, and in many ways welcome. But the big idea of the book, the main thesis of the book, that power is not merely shifting, power is decaying. The idea is that the decay means that those who have power now can do less with it, and power is more transient. So the theme of the book is that power is easier to get, harder to use, and much easier to lose. And that is happening everywhere, not just in one country, in one continent, or in one institution. It's happening in churches and in religions, and it's happening in armies. It's happening in governments, and it's happening in the big multilateral organizations. It's happening in criminal networks, and it's happening in the big philanthropic foundations. It is a trend that is driven by very important, powerful forces that include but transcend the information technologies and the internet. That doesn't mean that the world doesn't have any more very, very powerful individuals and institutions. Of course, the CEO of Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, or the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the General Dempsey, or the Pope, or the leadership in India, or China, or the United States, or Vladimir Putin, these are very powerful people. Head of Google and Facebook, of course, these are very powerful institutions. What I argue is not that these institutions don't have power. What I argue is that they have less power than their predecessors, or less power than they had before, and that the power is more constrained, and they can do less with it than in the past. In writing the book, I was very self-conscious of two things that made me very uneasy and insecure. And that's what it why it took me 7 years to write it. One is that it's about power. And so, I was thinking, how dare I, talk and write about this subject that has been the focus of attention for centuries. And it's a big, big theme of, you Google power and books on power and big tomes on power, from antiquity to yesterday, there's books on it by very smart people. So I felt very aware that I was talking about a subject that was very well treated already in the literature. The second thing that made me very self-conscious is that I was saying, not only was talking about power, but I was talking about powers in a way that was run contrary to the general narrative prevalent in the world today. In the world today, the notion is that power is concentrating, that fewer people have more power, and that income inequalities, of course, it's a driver of this, which is a reality. In many countries, wealth and income are becoming more concentrated, and that gives the owners of that wealth power, and that's undoubted. But then that translates into a mindset that says power is concentrating, and we are living. Power is like wealth. The more you have it, the more you will get to have. If you have wealth, you're going to become, there's a magnetic effect of having wealth, and that is that you get more, and power is the same. So I was aware of these two things, and I decided that my only hope for the book was to let the data speak, that instead of making the case on the basis of arguments and I would just I would try to collect as much evidence as possible and as scientific as possible and as rigorous and robust set of data and observations and research, and let that do the job of persuading my readers and my audience. I will not bore you with a lot of the numbers are there, but let me just give you a taste of some of the evidence that I use and some of the numbers. Power, of course, in the military realm is, armies and armed forces are the epitomizes power, right? Is the definition of power, the traditional, classic, simple definition of power is the ability of one actor to make others do or stop doing something. It can get far more complicated than that in the literature, but for our purposes, that definition is enough. Well, if you think about that, armies epitomizes that ability, the ability to stop others from doing something or make them do something. And there is a lot of evidence that power, the armed power, is mutating in fundamental ways, that power is shifting from very large armies to different forms of combatants, that a lot of money no longer buys you national security. And 9/11, I think, was the final evidence. It's estimated that the staging 9/11 cost Al-Qaeda something like $500,000 and inflicted damages, just economic damages, in the trillions. Not just the direct damages, but the damages and the costs associated with the reactions to 9/11. And we have seen a lot of evidence of small, in fact, quite primitive groups of combatants that acquire some sophisticated capabilities and are able to deny very sophisticated, very large, very expensive, very technologically advanced armies the ability to win. It's not that these insurgents and these new forms of armies are winning over the large, sophisticated armies, but they're surely denying them victory. The Taliban may not be winning over the coalition forces and NATO and the United States and in Afghanistan, but the Taliban is denying those coalition forces victory. It's very hard to argue that the United States and its allies in Afghanistan are winning. All we can argue is that they have created a situation, but it's far more is easier to argue that the Taliban have denied victory to this very powerful coalition. Think about Somali pirates. These are former fishermen in rickety boats that go out in these outboard motors and go out and they hijack some of the largest, most modern ships in the world. You know, some of the biggest tankers, the oil tankers, and all kinds of ships, and for ransom. And in neighboring Kenya, the prices of fancy real estate are booming because these pirates now have money and they invest it in real estate and condos in Nairobi and elsewhere. The world has responded to this by deploying one of the most sophisticated armadas in history, a fleet of naval vessels, of battleships, that is quite sophisticated and is multinational in nature. The NATO is there, and of course the European Union and the United States and India and China and the Ukraine and Turkey. Almost everyone has some battleships plying those waters, patrolling the waters, trying to stop the pirates. And they are not doing it. The numbers ebb and flow, but it's very dangerous. Those waters are not safe. Cargo ships and tankers now have to take extraordinary measures, very expensive measures, to try to avoid the attacks and the hijackings of the pirates. These are not just anecdotes. There is a fascinating study by a Harvard scholar called Ivana Regin he decided he was going to study asymmetric wars, and that he was going to measure the two sides of traditional wars by the typical metrics that you measure military power. Quantity of weapons and the number of, how large the troops are, and it's easy to measure power in that sense, in the capacity, in the endowments that generate power. And in the military, it's quite easy. And he did that for conflicts between 1850 to 1949. 1850 to 1949, he tracked all of the major armed conflicts, and he identified the two sides, and he measured the capacities, and he discovered that in that period, 12% of the time, the weaker side won. 12%. So as expected, a strong army was ahead, won. But then he extended the research from he then did the same study from 1950 to 1998. And in that period, the weak side won 55% of the time. That means that in this more modern period, the weaker side had a higher chance. It's more likely that it wins than it loses. And I think that speaks volumes about the nature of what we are seeing. And if you look at different wars, you will see how, in fact, there is a very powerful, very profound mutation of military power. The other arena, another set of examples that I use in the book has to do with what is happening in national politics, especially in democracies, but also in authoritarian governments. First, one needs to recognize that there are more countries in the world today. There has been a proliferation of nation states. The second thing is that the number of democratically elected governments has soared. We had, in 1990, which is in historical terms is like yesterday. In 1990, the world had 69 elected democracies. In 2012, it had 117. 69 in 1990 to 117 nations that the government was elected by the people. Half of humanity today lives in countries that have a democracy, where the government has been elected. And that does not include China. which of course does not have that kind of government. But if China were to democratize, then something like 80% of humanity would be living in democracies, which is unprecedented in history. So what that means and the trends are, essentially the central message is that life is becoming harder for tyrants. Time in power for dictators is becoming shorter. And the ones that remain are mostly those that have a lot of oil or a lot of resources. It's very hard to remain a dictator if you don't have some sort of wealth that is of an extractive nature. There are some examples, but they are not the norm. Think about what are the dictatorships that are left in the world, and in most cases you will see that they have a very strong availability of natural resources, of extractive industry type resources. But then if you think about what's happening to power in democracies, you find several fascinating trends. The first is that electoral landslides are becoming endangered species. If you trace the margin of electoral victory since 1970 to 2012, you see that they're shrinking. Around the world, Democrats are winning elections with thinner margins. The notion that there is a leader that inspires the voters and a huge majority of those that go and vote give him or her a strong mandate is very, very exceptional. What is the norm, what has become the norm, is voters divided and not giving the president or head of state, the prime minister, a very strong mandate. In fact, in the wealthiest democracies in the world, in the members of the OECD, there are 34 members of the OECD. They're all democracies. Of the 34, only 4 have a prime minister or a president that has a Congress that supports him or her. In 30 out of the 34, the head of state, of the president, or prime minister, has to contend with a legislature that is controlled by the opposition. And sometimes by more than the opposition, sometimes by a highly fragmented set of actors that then create the need for very complicated, unstable, unwieldy coalitions. And so what we have in national politics around the world is a trend that Frank Fukuyama has coined a word for that. He calls the trend towards vitocracies. Democracies that become vitocracies, where you have a lot of actors with the ability to veto the initiatives of others. A lot of actors, small, medium, large, that are capable of diluting, postponing, blocking, filibustering initiatives. And so you have these systems in which everyone seems to have just enough power to block others, but no one has the power to push through an agenda, a program, a vision, or a plan. And that is, I don't need to give you examples. I can give you the typical example that until recently was easy to deride and make fun of is Italy, right? You know, the dysfunctional country with a dysfunctional government that cannot get its act together and cannot govern. And then they had an election recently, and the outcome of the election is no government. So they go through the whole process of an electoral campaign and elections, and then they simply cannot get a government. That's an example of a vitocracy. So, but if you look at some of the elements that are driving this outcome in Italy, you will find them elsewhere too. The world politics are becoming Italian. Think sequester. Think sequester. In the United States, one of the most robust, sophisticated, mature democracies and one of the stronger institutional settings, political settings in the world. So you have this situation in which, you know, the country cannot agree, the politicians cannot agree on the very basic function of governing, which is to decide how to tax and spend for the country. So they decided, given that they couldn't agree, they said, well, let's kick the can and let's create a situation that is so horrible that when the moment comes, we will never do it and we will be forced to decide. And let's call it sequester. And the assumption is that we will never get to that point. And when we were, well, it came and there was no decision. And a highly irrational policy sequester, everyone will accept that sequestration in Washington and the way it's now working is a highly irrational, counterproductive, is a self-inflicted wound in this nation. And this just happens because of the nature of politics and the way it has fragmented, in the way it has created the elements of, some elements of Italian politics. And this is not just Italy and the United States. You find it in England, and you can see in the UK the very uncomfortable coalition that is now ruling there between the Liberal Democrats and the Tories. You find it in Israel, you find it in Australia, in New Zealand, in a lot of places in Europe, in Thailand. So the world politics is becoming Italianized, and that, I think, speaks to some of the trends about how power is now becoming easier to get, harder to use, and easier to lose. One other area where I can give you some examples is the most controversial one, which is the corporate sector in the world of business. And again, it's controversial because we have now this world in which we have very, very large corporations that are multinational in nature, that control huge assets, that control a lot of political actors, and they are lobbyists, and they have super PACs, and they, thanks to, in the United States, thanks to the Citizens United decision that gave voice and treats corporations as if they were individuals with freedom of speech, and therefore allows them to invest in politics in any way they can. There is a whole situation that speaks to the concentration of power, of corporate power, more and more. And that is undeniable, and I don't challenge that. My argument, however, is that life at the top is becoming more slippery than ever. Life at the top for corporations and life at the top for those that run the corporations. And again, there is plenty of statistics that support that. There is a study by two professors, NYU professors, that looked at the probability that a company that was at the top of the league would stay in that position 5 years hence. Top of the league defined as the top 20% in that sector. So they did the study in 1980. What is the probability that if your company would stay in the top 20% 5 years hence? And that probability was 90%. So in 1980, if you got to the top 20%, you were safe. 90% that 5 years after that day, you would still be at the top of the game. Well, 20 years later, that probability plummeted. And the turnover rates at the top are higher than ever. The turnover rates of CEOs is higher than ever. The CEOs that are so powerful, that earn obscene amounts of money, that are very often unaccountable, that screw up and yet they get a lot of money when they're fired. Well, these people are getting fired at unprecedented rates. I'm not hurting for them and I don't worry about them, but it surely indicates that there's something happening at that level. The book has a bunch of statistics about that. One that I think is very interesting is a measurement about brand-damaging accidents. Accidents that happen to corporations that hurt their reputation, reputational damaging effects. The probability that a large corporation would have that kind of accident that would wipe out a lot of value in their stock and would hurt them because of reputational damage was 20-something% in 1990. Today is 82%. That means that if you are a large corporation, the probability that you will have something happening to your brand that wipes out a big chunk of your equity is almost certain. That doesn't mean that you cannot recover. Toyota had that, right? Toyota had the cars that will get fired and so on, and there was the recall. You remember that. and the Toyota brand suffered quite significantly, but it recovered. But yet, they are at risk. There's a very interesting statistic about, do you remember in 1989, at the Exxon Valdez ran aground and had a huge oil spill in the pristine waters of Alaska. The values of Exxon went down 4% in 4 months as a result of that. Something like that happened in 2010 with British Petroleum in the Gulf of Mexico. The shares of British Petroleum went down 13% in 7 trading sessions. Much more, much faster, much deeper, and they're still not fully recovered. And there are other examples, but the point is, yes, the corporate sector is very powerful. The financial sector still deploys an amazing array of lobbyists in Washington and elsewhere that block legislation that hurts them. But assuming that they are all powerful is not correct. After the financial crisis, there were 5 or 6 groups that came out on top. J.P. Morgan and Barclays and Goldman Sachs and others. They concentrated a lot of assets. They bought the assets of a lot of the companies that went down. And Lehman, a lot of the good assets from Lehman Brothers were acquired by Barclays, and J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs purchased others, and so on. Well, most of the CEOs of these 5 or 6 groups are now in hot water. Some of them have been fired. They are no longer running these corporations. Bob Diamond, the head of Barclays, was just fired. HSBC, who is another bank that came on top, is also under regulatory attack because of all kinds of accidents and mishaps it had. JP Morgan, the same, and so on. Again, I'm not arguing that they're not powerful. I'm just arguing that for them, power doesn't feel like as it used to be. I can go on. I think there's a fascinating story to be told about what's happening in religions. The book discusses that and how, for example, the book, I asked myself, why is it that the Vatican is losing market share in the global market for souls? And that is happening in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in the Philippines and Brazil and Guatemala and Nigeria and other places. The number of people that identify themselves as Roman Catholics is dwindling. In Brazil, in the census in Brazil in 1970 asked, what religion are you? And 90% of Brazilians said, I'm Roman Catholic. In 2010, 60% said that. 500,000 Brazilians every year switch from Roman Catholicism to another religion. In Guatemala today, Guatemala used to be almost a completely Roman Catholic country. Today, the majority religion in Guatemala is a form of evangelical Christianity combined with Pentecostalism. One of the fastest versions of Christianity is Pentecostalism, which is a very different form. But again, even the Pentagon, even the Vatican, even the Vatican is not immune to the forces that are forcing power, to changing the nature of power. And why? Why is this happening? Normally, when I give this story and make my argument, and then I ask why, the typical answer is, of course, it's the internet. It's social media. It's Twitter and Facebook and Google. And I disagree with that. Not because I don't think that those are not very important transformational technologies, but because I think they are technologies. They're tools. And tools require users. And users have motivation and direction. The people that use those tools have a way of using them in certain direction. And they are motivated to use them by other forces. And those are the forces, I argue, that drive the decay of power. And the main reason in the book, and my argument rests I applied a conceptual framework that I derived from economics, or from the economics of imperfect competition. And it essentially has to do with barriers, what's happening to barriers to entry in the world of power. Those that have the powerful have barriers, shields, that protect them from contestants, from challengers, from rivals, from competitors. And my argument is that those shields are becoming less protective. There are forces at work in the world today that are eroding the capacity of those shields to protect those that have power in all of the realms that I have been discussing. And the list of these forces that are weakening these protective barriers are many. And to simplify, I group them in three large categories that I called revolutions. The more revolution, the mobility revolution, and the mentality revolution. The more revolution essentially tries to capture the fact that we live in an age of profusion, in an age of abundance. We have more of everything, thus the more revolution. We have more countries and more people. We have more political parties and more criminal organizations and more charities and more everything. Mostly we have more people. It took humanity until 1950 to reach the $2 billion people mark. From the beginning to 950, 2 billion. Well, we accumulated 2 extra million just in the last decade or two. Now we are at 7 billion. This is, of course, the most people that have lived in the planet ever. But it's also, we now have the youngest planet ever in terms of the age of the population. The world is very young, unevenly distributed because there are countries that are getting old in Europe and China, the United States. But on average, this is the youngest planet we have ever had. So it's not only that we have more people and younger, but now they live in cities. For the first time in history, most of the world lives in urban settings, not in farms and not in the fields. And they are better off. This is the wealthiest planet we have had in terms of the wealth of the population. That doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of poverty, but poverty is being lifted, and the people are being lifted out of poverty at unprecedented rates. Global GDP has multiplied fivefold since 1950. GDP per capita has increased 3.5 times. The fastest growing demography in the world today is the new middle class. There's no other group in humanity that is increasing so fast and expanding so fast as the middle class everywhere. Not everywhere. Of course, in Europe, and in the crisis-stricken countries, in the United States, the middle class is embattled, is shrinking, and is under pressure. But in places from China to India to Turkey to Brazil to Colombia or the Ukraine, the middle class is expanding very, very, very rapidly. This is a middle class that is also better educated, and it's everywhere. For example, one of the fantastic numbers of this expansion has to be with Africa. Africa's economy doubled since 2000. In the last 13 years, Africa's GDP multiplied by 2, which is not small feast. In 2000, Africa had 2 million internet users. Today, it has 120 million. And again, touch any variable in the world today, and you will see that it exploded in numbers. The number of scientists is unprecedented. The number of nurses, the number of doctors, anything. It's now far more. And that, I claim, has consequences for the way power is acquired and used and lost. But it's not just that we have more, that there is a more revolution going on. It is that there is a mobility revolution going on, and that more moves more. People, ideas, money, goods, services, financial crisis, pandemics, money, everything is moving. And power needs a captive audience. It's very hard to exert power and domination over a group of people that moves all the time. And the combination of the more and the mobility revolution, of course, feeds into the third, which is the mentality revolution, which is profound changes in mindset, in expectations, in aspirations, in ways of thinking. The notion that you will, that phrase, you're going to do this because that's the way it has always been done, has lost potency at an incredible rate in families and with teenagers, but also inside companies, and the relationship between corporations and their employees, their vendors, their clients, their consumers, shareholders. That has, the notion that things are done just because I tell you that it's done this way has lost great potency and great importance in the world. And there are plenty of examples about these profound changes in mindsets. One that I like mentioning is the one I discovered that divorce rates in India among the elderly are soaring, initiated by the women. These are marriages, of course, that have been, people have been married for 30, 40 years, and now the women are walking out. They are no longer willing to take care of the old man that is now their husband. And that has, that of course is driven by the three revolutions and the fact that they are models, they are examples, they have been empowered, they have their more material well-being. By the way, the same trend is observable in some of the Gulf countries. And these are not just anecdotes. The Michigan University started 40 years ago a project called the World Values Survey. Essentially, they went around and polled and surveyed individuals in a large number of countries, asking for opinions about values, expectations, ways of thinking. And if you look at the trends, are quite amazing, quite striking how the world has changed in those 40 years in terms of tolerance, in terms of a lot of the variables that are commonly associated with power. Together, these three revolutions are the drivers of the trend that I argue is transforming the world. The more revolution is helping challengers overwhelm the barriers that protected and protect the powerful. The mobility revolution helps them circumvent the barriers. And the mentality revolution is eroding the barriers, is corroding the basis and the foundations of these barriers. So more overwhelms, mobility circumvents, and the mentality corrodes and undermines. And together, you put it together, you shake it, and you have this trend where the power is easier to get, harder to use, and easier to lose. I will stop here, and of course there are two big remaining questions that I'm sure David and you will raise and we can discuss. One is, well, the first is it true? And second, so what? Who cares? And what are the consequences? And the third is it good or is it bad? Is there a lot to be worried about, or should we just celebrate what's going on? And I think that's what we should be discussing if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Moises. You've already stirred a lot of interest. There are a lot of questions, particularly related to the applicability of some of your ideas to various parts of the globe. Several questions about the EU. One is challenging. How do we reconcile the notion of greater power for small players with the movement of many countries toward large blocs like the EU? And then another asked if you could comment on Cyprus and the potential disruption of the Eurozone, and perhaps a broader question of what's the future of the Euro.
In one of my articles about, should I?
Please.
Is this working? In one of my articles, I start by asking, what do the European economic crisis, the Syrian tragedy, and climate change have in common? And my answer is that no one seems to have the power to stop them. No one seems to have the power to stop the killings in Syria. No one seems to have the power to contain the crisis in Europe, not even Angela Merkel. And no one seems to have the power to contain what we know is a trend that is going to create a lot of human suffering in the future with climate change. So the erosion of power and the decay of power, I think, is at the root of these things. And the question about Cyprus, I think, is very much an example. Is the same. You could also say the same about Greece. These are tiny countries. These are very tiny economies that somehow managed to destabilize the European project and the larger European countries and economies, and in fact are having consequences for the global economy. And I think they are evidence of I see those examples, and I see the trends that I discuss about the decay of power. Then there is the other question that you ask and the person asks, which is to reconcile the movement towards large blocs. Well, the problem with the large blocs is that they don't seem to wield a lot of collective power. So the European Union doesn't seem to, there is a very good example about the power of the European Union. There are these rocks in between Spain and Morocco called perejil in Spanish, parsley. They are rocks. And both Spain and Morocco claim sovereignty over those rocks. And one day, for reasons that are not clear, a Moroccan platoon took a boat and went to the islands. And Spain and Morocco were about to go to war. And the European Union and the bloc could do nothing, or were unable to do anything. The person that solved the problem was Colin Powell. The United States, who was in Asia doing something else, he had to move and come back to take care of perejil, of some rocks in the middle of the Mediterranean. So that tells you a lot about the power of the large blocs. But underlying the question, there is a larger issue, which I think is very important, and it's at the core of how we govern ourselves. And that is, what is the optimal size of a country in the 21st century? And the answer, and we can discuss it further, my answer is that in political terms, the answer is small. In economic terms, the answer is large. So if you want to be successful as a country in the 21st century in terms of economics, try to be larger. And if you want to be governable and successful and democratic and politically stable, try to be smaller.
On a different subject, given your own background in journalism, someone asks, is citizen journalism fundamentally disrupting traditional media power? Is it analogous to guerrilla warfare, or might it supplant media as we know it?
That's a huge, fantastic question that I don't think that there is a clear answer. I think we have elements of the answers. So first, let's recognize, in terms of the decay of power, how improbable it is that a guy called Craig was able to destroy the business model of the New York Times. he invented Craigslist, and there it went. You know, the business model where classified ads were the main source of revenues for the Washington Post and all of the dailies, went with that. And they haven't recovered since. So that talks and that speaks about the disruptive power of the internet in this case. But again, the internet with direction and motivation by a user. There was more than the internet to what Craig did with his lists. Concerning the future of journalism, I think we are living in a transitional time where you have a lot of fragmentation at the level of journalists, but a lot happening in distribution channels. And the distribution channels are altering and appending the traditional structures. So you have something like the Huffington Post that was just sold a couple of years ago for $350 million to AOL. And what the Huffington Post did was essentially to collect the articles and the content of others and just put it together. It's what they call elegantly call an integrator. Others have not as nice names for that. But essentially, I don't want to. This could be the subject of a entire talk. I lived through it. When I started in 1996, Foreign Policy Magazine did not have a website. And today it is, I think, the dominant website on international affairs. So I went through a lot of these agonizing decisions and challenges and confusions. And I don't think there is an easy answer. But the changes that we're seeing in terms of multiple screens, and all of us now have multiple screens. Our television plays in different functions. We acquire and use our consumer behavior in terms of information has been drastically altered. And so I think we are just in the middle of it, and it's very hard to make sense as to where it's going.
Given what you just said about for economic purposes, it's good to be large, and for governance purposes, it's good to be small, what do you think is going to happen in China as viewed through the lens of the decay of power?
Of all the countries I have visited, the one where I see the three revolutions most powerfully at work is China. The more, it's obvious, the more of everything that you see in China and the expansion of a middle class that is not just now, is not enough for them to have a building that is called a school or a hospital that didn't exist 5 years, but they now want that what happens inside that building is quality education and quality health. And as we know, for governments, it's much easier to build a building and call it a school than to provide good education. Providing services is much harder for governments than providing infrastructure, of course. And now China has to go beyond building the infrastructure, beyond building the streets and the housing and the schools and the hospitals, and ensure that there's quality there and people are demanding quality there. And that is very, very hard to deliver. And that is creating frustrations, and that is part of the three revolutions and everything else. And mobility. Talk about mobility. The level of mobility inside China in terms of movement to the cities, in terms of internal migration and connectivity, it's quite staggering. And that alters and appends political structures. When you have millions of people coming to a city and establishing themselves in a city in a year or 2 years, governing that city is a completely different ballgame. So if you go through all of the things that are happening, you would expect that China will be deeply destabilized by all of this. And the question is, will the government and will the leadership have the ability to adapt, adjust, and respond in a timely and effective manner to all of these changes? And the jury's out on that.
We have a number of other questions relating to, do you think that the BRIC countries are going to collaborate more with each other, and what do you think the effect of what are your thoughts on that? And to what extent do you think the shift of power relates to the end of the Russian Empire, or the Soviet Empire?
Yeah, two good questions. The BRIC countries stand for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And if you want to add an S, as they did recently, South Africa. So ask yourselves, what do Brazil, Russia, India, and China and South Africa have in common? Fast growth until last year. That's the only thing they had in common. They are very large countries that had significant GDP growth in the early 2000s and now are sputtering. And so assuming that they have enough of common interest to act together, it has to rest on the assumption that they have more in common than just large size and fast growth that is now sputtering. And that's why, and there is, of course, it's very tempting to say that they have emerged as a new countervailing power to the United States or to the traditional power structures in the world. I don't see it. I haven't seen them acting. Show me an initiative that matters to the world where the BRICS have acted together in a meaningful way. You will not find it. They have summits, and they have meetings, and they have statements, and they have promises. But when things happen, where are the BRICS in the conversations about North Korea? Where are the BRICS in the conversations about Iran and nuclear weapons? Where are the BRICS in the conversations about climate change? So, it's very hard to imagine that they can act in a cohesive, as a cohesive bloc, despite the rhetoric. The second very good question, is if a lot of what I'm saying was not driven by the end of the Soviet Union, and I think it does. I think that's a very powerful turning point. And it was not just that. That, I think, is an important marker. But as important as the collapse of the Soviet Union is the integration of China to the global economy. Essentially, China delivered a labor shock to the global economy that has no precedent. All of a sudden, a couple of billion workers, low-wage billion workers, started appending the cost structures of the global economy, and you have all kinds of new trading realities that you have to deal with, and countries discovered that they were not just competing with their neighbors, but they were competing with manufacturing that was made 2 continents away. And so it's the combination of the fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of China and India and others, plus globalization, plus the information revolution and that connectivity, and I think the 3 revolutions that I described.
I'd like to, we're unfortunately running out of time when there's so much of interest we could explore here. I think we should end the question period with the question that you posed. So what? In particular, here is an audience. Why does it matter to us?
So there is a lot to celebrate, and there is plenty that should be welcome of the trends that I described. These trends create a world of opportunity for people that did not have opportunities in the past. A lot of groups that were excluded are now have a shot. This world is not as good for tyrants, monopolists, and other abusers of power. So there is plenty to welcome and plenty to celebrate, and hoping that it continues and that there is more of it. And I agree, I'm with that. Except for one area where I see a downside, and that is the decay of power in national governments. The vitocracy, the proliferation of vitocracy, the proliferation of democratic systems that cannot deliver the kind of policies and decisions that in a timely, effective manner. And that creates all sorts of threats. That opens the door to what I call in the book the terrible simplifiers. The proverbial messianic leaders that will tell you, well, enough of this silliness in which no one is in charge. I am in charge, and I'm going to get it right. And that, I think, it's very, very dangerous. That is the sort of sentiments and frustrations that drove to power, that brought to power Putin, Berlusconi, and Hugo Chavez. That's exactly the kind of sentiment, together with the fighting for corruption. The way in which corruption is becoming a big deal, and intolerance and impatience with corruption is now becoming the norm around the world. And the way the world is waging the war on corruption is very corrupted and is very damaging and is undermining democracy everywhere. Again, the war on corruption and the search for the proverbial honest man, honest leader that will not be in government and not steal is what brought us Putin, Chavez, and Berlusconi, among others. So rather than the search for individuals and honest leaders or strong men or women that will stop the anarchy and the autocracy, we need institutions, and we need ways of governing ourselves that are different. The fact that we have weak governments is the foundation underlying our inability as humanity to deal with the long and growing lists of problems that no country can tackle alone. As a result of globalization, the number of problems that require collective international action has increased. From nuclear proliferation to climate change, to pandemics, to financial crisis, to failed states, the list, we know the list. So the number of problems that require collective action is booming. The capacity of the world to act together to deal with this problem is either stagnating or declining. In economics, when demand is vastly superior to supply, you have inflation. In geopolitics, you have a lot of people dead. When you have that big gap in the supply of what we call global public goods. And we're having that. We're having a stagnant or declining capacity of the world to act together. Why? Because the people that are around the table trying to act together are very weak. And so sitting at a table, these are weak governments that don't have mandates, that they have not won elections by a significant margin, that they have to govern through frail, complicated, unwieldy coalitions. So these are the governments that sit around the table trying to decide that inevitably in those decisions there have to be compromises and costs incurred by this government and these countries. And so they cannot afford to go back to their country and say, well, we have agreed to do something with about climate change, and that implies that there is these costs for us as a nation. They're going to be thrown out of power in no time, right? So that is why weakness at home, autocracies at home, is blocking action at the international level. And that is a threat to humanity. And that is the downside of the decay of power. And there are things that can be done, but the first one is to recognize that this is happening and the need to act on it.
Jerome has just given us a little more time. So we've got time for another question to take it one step further. In your book, you say that disruptive innovation has not yet arrived in politics and government, and you predict that it will. Would you like to speculate on what form it might take?
So that's right. And so what I say in the book, the way I end in the book, is by noting that how profoundly our lives have changed as a result of innovation in the last 20 years. Last 20 years have been amazing in the terms of innovation. We have had more innovation in the last 20 years in some areas than in the last 2,000 years. And it goes, and I'm not talking just about the technologies that we use every day. I'm not talking about the Googles and Facebooks and Wikipedias of the world. I'm talking about decoding the DNA I'm talking about the fact that we have discovered more celestial bodies in the last 20 years than the last 200 years. About the fact that we have now changed the world in very fundamental ways, and that we have revolutions that touch everyone. And so if you look around what you do every day, since you wake up until you go back to bed at night, your life has been completely transformed in the last 20 years. You have been touched, and we have been touched by innovation in very significant ways in almost everything we do, except in the way we govern ourselves. There, nothing has happened. So you have this world in which a lot is happening in terms of appending, changing lives, improving, transforming, disrupting technologies and new ways of doing things, new ways of thinking, new ways of behaving, except in the way we govern ourselves. And that's unsustainable. And I believe that the history shows us that when this happens, there is a wave of political innovation. And that's why I believe that in the coming years, we are going to see very profound and surprising and positive innovations in politics and the way we govern ourselves. And I don't have a detailed blueprint about what's happening. That's the next book.
Dr. Naim, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
This concludes our program for the evening, and on behalf of the World Affairs Council, I ask you to join me in thanking Moises Naim for his excellent talk and discussion. And thanks to the audience for these terrific questions. As a reminder, Dr. Naim's latest book, The End of Power, is here for sale, and he'll be available for the next few minutes to sign copies. Please join me in thanking Dr. Naim.